In the moments between committing a crime and sitting in the courtroom, convicts don't always understand the gravity of their actions. But when the judge finally delivers the verdict that'll put them behind bars, only then reality dawns upon them. While some weep out of guilt, some cuss their victims, some show no remorse, and some of them even laugh at the judge. Join us as we have a look at how convicts reacted after hearing their sentence. Number 11. Ricky Hand. Let's say you're in a courtroom witnessing a judge delivering his verdict in the case of an armed robber. What would you expect from the culprit who had just received 40 years in prison? Maybe he would break down in tears, or maybe he's too stunned to even speak or move. But then there's, of course, the possibility of him screaming in anger and cussing at the judge. But when you commit 30 robberies before being caught again, you can't expect to simply walk out of the courthouse with just community service, right? Well, Ricky Hand already anticipated that, and that's when he came prepared. Hand's reputation does not come with his crimes, though. After all, he's a man who brought feces and urine to the Ohio courtroom. That's right, a convict throwing feces and urine in protest has to be a new thing. After hearing his sentence, Hand was so distraught that he kept asking the judge if he had really just given him 40 years in prison. And when he couldn't control his anger, he simply reached out his arm and slung some urine and feces all over the place. His first target was his own attorney because, how dare he not find a better deal for someone committing robberies while out on parole? Well, that's one way to show your disappointment and also earn another felony charge. What the sheriff couldn't understand, though, was how Ricky wasn't thoroughly searched before entering the courtroom, because clearly one can bring unusual parting gifts to the Ohio courthouse and almost get away with it. Number 10. Antonio Barbeau. Teenagers only turn into monstrous murderers in movies and crime shows, right? Well, Antonio Barbeau turned fiction into reality. It only took a hunger for pizza and marijuana for Antonio to turn into a ruthless killer. Barbeau was 14 years old when he decided to murder his great-grandmother with a hatchet in order to steal money from her house, and he didn't commit his homicide alone. He also brought along his friend Nathan Pape, another 14-year-old, as his assistant, and this bone-chilling hearing looked like a taping of a crime show as the prosecution showed a sharp hatchet, aka the murder weapon, to the judge again and again. The judge stated that this case is one of its own kind and that he had never seen anything like it in his legal practice. After Antonio Barbeau didn't contest the first-degree intentional homicide, his fate had been sealed. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with eligibility for parole in 36 years. The teenager will be 50 years old by the time that his first potential parole comes around. And Barbeau's reaction could not have been more apologetic. He instantly broke down into tears and couldn't complete his apology statement. When he couldn't control his sobbing, his attorney continued to read his statement for him. And even he began to sob within seconds. Kind of predictable for a teenager, right? Number 9. Luis Bracamontes. Smiling through the horrifying testimony of 2 gruesome murders, looking bored when your crimes are being counted, and then eventually admitting that you didn't even care about the pain that you'd inflicted on your victims and their families. These are some classic signs of a psychopath sitting within a courtroom. And Luis Bracamontes, well, he displayed them all. Bracamontes had entered the United States illegally for the 3rd time when he opened fire on 3 sheriff deputies in North Carolina. He ended up killing 2 police officers and severely wounded the 3rd along with an innocent bystander. As spine-chilling as these crimes are, Bracamontes' reaction is perhaps the most bizarre and disturbing part of the case. When Luis sat in the court for his verdict, it was a no-brainer. He was either going home or to jail, and his only fate was a death sentence. And as the prosecution read their opening statements, the soon-to-be convict decided that the process was quite boring to him. When his crimes were narrated in front of everyone, he simply started to smile, as if he was openly proud of his actions. But that wasn't enough either, because later on, he lost it. His unfiltered rant began with cussing out the murdered police officers, and he called their families effing stupid. and then he proceeded to cuss out the judge and the prosecution for putting him on the stand. And you would think that he was done at that point, but no, he just kept on interrupting the court proceedings with his random outbursts of expletives. Eventually, the judge had to throw him out, and even then, he threw one last F you at the judge as he walked away. Yep, tell us you're a psychopath without saying that you're a psychopath. Number 8. Michael Marin. Michael Marin's story might be the most tragic of our whole list, because when convicts cry, get angry, or remain indifferent after hearing their sentence, Marin chose to do something entirely different. He ended up taking his own life. This case isn't the most typical one on our list, mainly because no one was hurt by Michael Marin. The millionaire businessman's story is the classic example of a crime that was wrought out of desperation. When Marin couldn't keep up with the piling mortgage of his house, he then tried to auction it off, and that didn't work. He then tried to sell his house in a lottery, and that didn't work either. So his last resort came down to a poorly executed arson. Yep, Michael burned down his own home and then claimed to make it out alive by wearing a scuba suit and climbing down from the second floor using rope and a ladder. And even that story had a lot of holes within it. The fire department would conduct a full investigation, and they found multiple fire points within the home. That investigation would blow his cover within a matter of days. The police were convinced that the fire in the $3.5 million mansion was deliberate. And in the state of Arizona, arson is on the same level as second-degree murder. And so that meant that Marin could face up to 16 years in prison, and he just simply couldn't handle that. Far from it, in fact. As the judge recited his verdict, the footage shows Marin putting something in his mouth and taking a sip from a plastic water bottle. Moments later, he would collapse to the floor. Police officers and medics were quick to get him the help that he needed, but in the hospital, he was pronounced dead. The way that Marin collapsed, it was obvious that he had tried to take his own life, and the canister containing cyanide pills in his car also seemed to confirm that theory. Tragic end to a case that didn't hurt anyone involved, except for the perpetrator himself. Number 7. Jacob Matt Morgan. It's hard to have sympathy for a convict guilty of burning his 14-month-old brother alive, even after he breaks down in tears after hearing his sentence. Now, from the get-go, the Morgan's case is bizarre and frightening right to its core. There's not any kind of conclusive reason or motive for him to get rid of his infant brother Joshua, and by all accounts, he's not a raging psychopath either. But instead, the 17-year-old is actually autistic. The fact remains, though, that a child was burned alive, and Jacob didn't even bother to call 911, or even make an attempt to save the life of his baby brother. In fact, the only help that the victim got was when the neighbors called the fire department and then tried to save him, but by then it was far too late. The police described the crime scene as a classic sign of arson, and the fire was started at multiple points in the trailer. And as far as the ruses go, Jacob was sleeping when he smelled something burning, and on instinct he only saved himself, and not his 14-month-old brother. The teenager accepted the punishment without admitting to the crime. The judge in the case would end up giving him 15 years in prison, and upon hearing his sentence, Jacob simply collapsed to the floor, broke down in sobs as he kept saying, "I'm sorry," and he was also seen praying moments after hearing his sentence. As he's led away from the court, his crying became even more rampant, and to this date, he still maintains that he was innocent. Number 6. Keyshawn Mann. Keyshawn Mann's hearing broke the courtroom into a brawl as the convict's family got into it with a heated row of the victim's loved ones. Mann's family justified his actions and even demanded that the case should be thrown away. Now, you would think that's one family with the audacity to be this inconsiderate and narcissistic, and you wouldn't have been wrong if Keyshawn wasn't 13 years old and his victim wasn't his mother's abusive boyfriend. Jermel Stokes had a habit of beating his girlfriend and her 13-year-old son, Keyshawn. When the abuse didn't stop, Mann decided to take matters into his own hands. He creeped behind Stokes and then shot him straight in the head. But that's not the ground for innocence. The end doesn't justify the means for the judge, and Keyshawn would be sentenced as a juvenile until he turns the age of 21. After that, he may be eligible for an adult sentence, that could possibly result with life in prison. When the teenager heard that he was going to jail, his reaction was visibly distraught. It was obvious that he couldn't comprehend that his life was essentially over, as the world won't remember him as anything else but a criminal. And that is when all hell broke loose. Keyshawn's mother kept alleging that no one could understand the abuse that she and her son had suffered at the hands of the victim, and that was enough to cause a ruckus in the court, as Stokes' family didn't want to hear any of it. The police and the court staff all had to stop the brawl, as the young convict would be led away to his holding cell. Number 5. David Moses. When it comes to the matter of resentencing after your juvenile years, any criminal would want to be on their best behavior to get in the good books of the judge. Not David Moses, though. After all, his story is not that of any ordinary teenager that was caught in an unfortunate circumstance. First off, he was charged guilty for killing and burglarizing an 81-year-old woman after she had welcomed him into her home to make a phone call. And how did David repay that kindness? By beating the elderly woman to death just by using his bare hands. He also admitted to being high on marijuana and other hallucinogens when he committed the heinous crime. And that wasn't his first rodeo. Before making his first kill, Moses was also accused of assaulting his sister, a cousin with a developmental disorder, and other children in his group home. But those were in his juvenile years, and he had another chance to redeem himself in front of the judge by proving that he had repented for his crimes. Yet that was just too boring for old David Moses. His resentencing hearing was eerily creepy, to say the least. The convict appeared to be bored out of his mind, enough to fall asleep not once but twice in his chair, and all of that when the court was recounting his horrifying crimes and deciding his fate. Even when he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, he simply sat calmly in his chair as if it was the typical Tuesday morning for him. There was no remorse on his face, and he even chuckled for no apparent reason. Of course, the victim's family felt uncomfortable and angry at the sheer display of narcissism from David Moses. No criminal could have been more comfortable in that seat than he was. It felt like he was just waiting for the proceeding to end so that he could go back to his prison life. It's creepy, shocking, and quite spine-chilling. Number 4. Shondell Jackson. Sometimes convicts make it their life mission to assure you that they don't feel any remorse or guilt for the life that they've taken away. When their sentence is announced, they struggle to come to terms with it, not because they feel guilty. It's just the first time that they realize their action has consequences. Shondell Jackson, a 19-year-old murderer, is no different. He did not hesitate to kill 21-year-old Nathan Potter in an attempted robbery. What really ticked Potter's family off, though, was the fact that Jackson's only reason to inflict pain on them was a lack of control and impulse. Later on, there were no apologies or excuses from him to make up for his crimes, just pure evil and a sense of gratification. Throughout the court proceedings, Shondell did not leave any chance to smirk and laugh at the victim's family. As he sat there unbothered and unfazed, he smiled during the victim impact statement. And it only gets worse from there. The Potter family described Jackson as pure evil as he kept hand gesturing and taunting them in the court, and can't say that I disagree with that assessment, but Shondell was capable of more than smirking at his victim's family. When the presiding judge finally announced his sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, he turned back in sheer anger at Nathan Potter's family. His facial expressions were enough to show his disgust and hatred as the judge continued with her verdict. When Shondell didn't stop turning around, an officer had to forcefully hold him and keep his head in front, but it doesn't end there. When it finally sunk in for Jackson that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, he then tries to break free from the police officers in anger, and it was obvious that his target was the Potter family, who didn't leave any avenue to make sure that justice was served. Things then got out of hand again, and a police officer had to pepper spray Jackson in order to get him to comply, and as he's led away from the courtroom, the officer held him by his head. Number 3. Donta Wright. Karen Klee entered the courtroom for pretrial of her son's murder in hopes of forgiving the murderer. She wanted to find closure for the death of her 18-year-old son Jordan, who was the light of her life. Such acts of kindness do not go unnoticed, but what Karen didn't know was that the murderer of her son had no remorse or guilt for shooting her son to death in an attempted robbery. Donta Wright was 17 years old when he killed Jordan Klee, not too far from his apartment complex. It did not take a lot for him to admit to his crimes, and his confession of guilt was the most bizarre and horrifying thing that anyone could have witnessed. As Donta was questioned on his guilt and motive, he answered all of the questions so calmly and willingly, as if he was simply talking with a friend. The answers came naturally to him, and he didn't hesitate or lose his voice when he described how he had killed Jordan. What made matters worse was the attorneys made their statements and Jordan's family wept, but Donta simply stood there smiling and laughing. When he made his statement in the courtroom, he did not apologize or even reference the crime that got him into that position in the first place. He simply assured his family that he would be home soon and that he loves them. The judge even asks if that's all he has to say, and Donta Wright couldn't bother to save another breath on a sorry. If anything, he seemed extremely happy with his statement. Witnessing the utter disregard for Jordan and his family, the judge even suggested a full-blown trial for Wright. When Karen Klee maintained that she wanted to move on and find some closure, the judge sentenced the narcissist murderer to 25 to 52 years in prison. And there were no protests from Donta Wright. He just casually made his way out of the courtroom as if he were taking a stroll in the garden. Number 2. Cameron Herron. You may not remember this convict by his name, but it's hard to miss that striking, wide-eyed gaze that was plastered all over the internet for all of the wrong reasons. Cameron's crime is a vehicular homicide that ended up taking the lives of a mother and her 21-month-old daughter. But that wasn't the reason why the case got so much internet attention. Believe it or not, Cameron Herron's good looks and Instagram pictures made him an internet celebrity overnight. It didn't matter what his crimes were. People simply wanted the 18-year-old to walk free because it was just a mistake. The judge didn't agree though, and even though he believed that Cameron did not intend to kill the mother and child, racing on the Bayshore in a new Ford Mustang isn't just a mistake. The car was Cameron's high school graduation gift, and he wanted to show it off to his friend. So it only seemed natural that he and his friend would take it on an iconic boulevard to race each other. When Cameron made the impact, he was driving at 102 miles per hour, and it was obvious that the family was not going to make it. Even then, Herron counted on his influential rich family and the notion of unintentional homicide and his young age for the judge to go easy on him. He sat in the courtroom as the perfect compliant child who was well aware that he's now a criminal. Not to mention, his lawyer even argued that the client's brain wasn't even fully developed and he couldn't fully comprehend his actions. Well, I'm pretty sure that an 18-year-old knows that when you lose control of the car, accidents can happen. And when accidents happen, people can die. What Cameron did not see coming was the judge sentencing him for 24 years in prison, and his reaction made the headlines. Even though he was wearing a mask as a preventative measure from COVID, the shock and disbelief was captured in his eyes. His gaze widened, his eyebrows shot up, and his face lost all of its color, and he couldn't believe that a race night would take away half of his life. Cameron was seen sobbing in the arms of his mother, and gone was the calm demeanor as the reality set in. Number 1. Randall Moore. Criminals have their own personally crafted ways of showing no remorse for their heinous actions, and Randall Moore's modus operandi is just a passive, unemotional, and blank face that left everyone speechless. Even the judge in the case couldn't help but notice how disassociated and detached that Moore looked all throughout the proceedings of the case, and when you hear his crime, you'll also be left weirdly confused about his lack of remorse. He didn't kill anyone randomly in the street while committing a robbery, neither did he get into a fight. Moore was charged with first-degree murder of his wife. He had taken the vows to cherish and protect her, and also retain a loving partner until death do them part, but along the way, no one knows when Randall turned into a raging criminal. When his wife refused to let him meet with their son, he completely lost it. Before killing his wife, he kidnapped and assaulted her. But that's not it. Randall Moore truly manned up to his murderous streak because he also shot a police officer named Todd Rowland. In his statements, he claimed that all of it could have been avoided if his wife had simply let him meet his son, and he hopes that his crime is a lesson for all spouses who try to separate children and their father. Then he proceeds to tell the court that he could have shot Officer Randall 25 times, but he didn't, so his family should be grateful for that. And you would think that it doesn't get worse from there? However, the court transcripts show that Moore had no shame or any feelings of guilt for killing his wife, and when the judge delivered his decision for 3 life terms in prison, his reaction was viscerally shocking. The judge finished the verdict, called him out for his cold-blooded murder, and then sealed his fate in prison for the rest of his life. All that Randall Moore could do after that was to nod at the judge, as if he was having an everyday meeting conversation at the dinner table. 2 heinous crimes, and his reaction is just a nod. It's not easy to make sense of the indifference that these criminals show to violence and murder, but if anything, it just goes to show the ugly but real side of human depravity.